Hello, welcome to this video where I'm going to show you how I made this monstrous tree character. This was inspired completely by the episode 19 of Adventure Zone, Petals to the Metal Chapter 2, and I just wanted to make a version of Trent the Treant that had a better chance at surviving the encounter. So to make this, I decided to work with clay, but I decided to use aluminium foil for the armature. And I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted it to look like. So first I made kind of like a funnel shape because I wanted to have space inside of his head to use a tea light so that his eyes can be glowy in the end. And I'm just using different pieces of aluminium foil and hot glue to add the arms or branches and to add bulk to the torso and all the different things to create the shape of a tree trunk and basically the foundation for my sculpting. One by one I'm adding little roots as well. This helps a lot with the stability of the piece. At the beginning I didn't know I was going to make a base for this. I'm also reinforcing the hole in the back with some more tin foil. And I'm just using different pieces to shape and sculpt the tree trunk to make it look like it has knots and personality. I also used it to shape the main features of the face, like the brow bone, as well as making the creepy fingers at the end of his arms. And I'm just using as much tinfoil as needed and just carefully shaping everything. So to make his face, I just cut out some holes for the eyes and mouth, and to cover the top of his head I kind of made a bowl-like shape. And when this armature of aluminium is done, I am breaking out my air dry clay and I just start covering it little by little. I have a little bowl of water on hand to help me with the smoothing and to also keep it from sticking to my fingers too much. And I'm taking my time, carefully covering every bit of the surface of the tin foil. On first pass, I'm just concentrating on covering everything in a layer of clay. The aluminium armature has been shaped pretty well, so I have a really good guide in following the shapes. I do make some modifications, of course, especially around the roots. They got thickened a lot more by the end. But I'm just essentially covering the whole thing as thoroughly as possible. Of course, this was a lengthy process. It took me a couple of hours. But before all the clay completely dries, I used an old toothbrush and this pokey tool to give the whole thing a bark texture. And I'm just drawing lines kind of in an organic way, following the shapes. And I just go and do this for the entire surface of the clay. It took about 2 full days for this to completely dry out, and as a base coat I used a dark brown to give it some color. I'm being very thorough, kind of pressing my brush to get into all of those nooks and crannies from the bark texture. And I'm using acrylic paint, of course. After that first coat of dark brown has dried, I am using a lighter chocolate brown to overbrush the entire surface to bring in that first foundation of variation of color. And after that I'm going to be using even lighter, almost tan color to dry brush and bring it to life. At this point, Trent the Treant was actually weighing quite a bit. Next, I am using a black wash of shellac ink to go over the entire surface. I know that it looks like I'm ruining it, but this is actually just another layer to building up to what's going to be the final look, and it's actually really, really important and flattering. It just flows into those grooves, but it doesn't completely cover everything. Like those other coats of paint still matter because they come through the transparent wash. But to lighten it up, I use the same chocolate brown as from before, and I dry brush all over the surface again. And I already have a much more varied coloration after it dried. So this is the point I decided that it needed a base, because the roots were a little bit flimsy, and when the clay dried they raised up a bit. So I'm just using a little bit of foam board and just cutting out a shape that's just slightly bit larger than the roots of the tree. And I'm just cutting it out with a sharp knife. I'm also beveling the edges so that it's not very sudden edge, so that it looks a little bit more organic. And because this is foam core, I just use a lighter to melt those edges a little bit so that it becomes easier to paint. Otherwise all of those little holes in the foam would be absorbing a lot of paint. To base it, I first traced around the roots, and I'm using some PVA glue and a very small pebbles and a mixture of fine granite and sand. And I do this for all of the area that's not gonna be covered by the roots. The next thing I want to do is to make it look like it has moss and algae growing on it. So I'm using the same method of PVA glue and scattering on this mixture of green ground cover that has synthetic and natural bits mixed in together for a variation of texture and color. And I'm just picking out areas of my little tree monster, covering maybe areas that I'm not too happy with and accentuating some parts. Okay, so I wanted Trent to have a few leaves, so I'm using this little sprig of silk leaves, and I'm just painting them dark green first as a base coat with acrylic paint, of course. And I'm just covering the entire surface on both sides of the leaves. I also have these little plastic plants that I knew I was going to be using around the base. To bring out the texture in those silk leaves, I'm using a nice olive green to rub over with my finger and catching that texture. It makes it look very dimensional. And to bring to life those little plastic plants, I used a bit of that olive green and a little bit of yellow. When the ground cover has dried on the base, I use some shellacking mixed with some brown paint to go over it. And I'm going to be using the same mixture to go over all of the mossy bits and basically the entire surface of the bark to set it. This is going to make sure that none of that scatter is ever going to be flake and make a mess around wherever this piece is going to be displayed. Also, it has the fortunate side effect of warming up the tone of the bark, which I was quite happy with. When that has completely dried, I am using a generous amount of hot glue and some pressure to stick the tree to the base. And also I am going to be going all around the edges of the roots, basically filling in the gaps and securing down the piece to the base. But of course it needed a little bit more cover, and I used the same mixture of construction sand and fine granite. Until that dries, I am sticking on some of the leaves that I painted before, and also I painted the tea light brown and securing the remaining leaves to the very back of it, making sure that I leave a small space for the button. And this way, when I place it inside of the hole, it's not gonna look like something out of place. It's gonna look like just a cluster of leaves back there, and I can still easily access the button. Of course, I am going over the base with a brown acrylic paint again to bring everything together and to hide that seam of hot glue, to blend it in somewhat. It already looks a little bit better. And I decided that I didn't want to have just holes for his mouth and eyes, so I used a little bit of this gold tissue paper, and really I just folded it up and scrunched it up and glued it inside of his head. And now when I turn on the tea light, it actually has a more subtle, colder colored glow. While the base dries, I pulled out the same olive green I used on the leaves, and I'm just brushing on little patches of green for a little bit more of a color variation. Also, I really liked the idea of this tree having a lot of algae growing on it. Back to the base, I'm just dry brushing a tan color all over to catch all of those little pebbles and stones. And to finish the base, I pulled out a bunch of plastic plants and static grass clusters, and I just decorated the base. And here we are. Trent the Treant 2.0 is finished. This was a really fun project. It was definitely something new for me. I just recently became more interested in working with clay, so it was a little bit of a challenge. I've never made a piece this big before, but I'm very pleased with the results, and it's really fun to create something that was inspired by one of my favorite pieces of media out there. The Adventure Zone is a wonderful podcast. I really recommend it to everyone. And as you can see, the little button is still operable, and it's still well hidden and blended in, and his eyes glow. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like these sort of creative projects, please do subscribe to my channel. I have a lot more ideas and a lot more projects coming. And go to my channel where I have a bunch of different projects already. They're ready for you to watch. I have some miniature dioramas, some embroidery projects, some upcycle projects, and paper crafts. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a nice day. Bye.